Ken, I know that you work in the risk and compliance world. I'd love to pick your brain on educate our folks on what's the difference between risk and compliance.
So I think the way to look at it, compliance is checking a box. Compliance meets the bare minimum of regulatory, of normally of a regulatory a law or a we'll call PCI, for example, is a guidance. It's not a law. It's not a regulatory body. It's guidance from the credit card companies, right? So, uh, in reality, meeting that compliance, is it ever going, just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure. I've always said that a good run security program, compliance falls out of that. It should be a deliverable out of a good program, right? Because if you look at it, it's a lot of best practices. It's a lot of framework pieces that are tied together. And sometimes you figure out how to crosswalk all that and how to marry it up and figure out what meets the requirements. So you can meet compliance. Risk, on the other hand, is really what we do from a cybersecurity standpoint. Ultimately, our job as cybersecurity professionals is to mitigate risk, right? And part of that is also to explain risk, to measure risk, to evaluate risk, to illuminate risk, right? So realistically, our job is a risk management job. What we're trying to do is translate all that technology of what cybersecurity is, what the attack vectors are, all of this threat coming at us, understand that, put it into risk language, which is what most business leadership thinks in. They think in risk. They think in enterprise risk, right? Because that's financial risk, that's operational risk, that's all the components that feed into regulatory compliance. All of that is risk, right? Because if I don't meet my regulatory requirements, I don't meet my compliance requirements, I've now added risk to the company, right? So I think that's where, that's the reason I moved from a CISO job into my last CISO gig into a risk and compliance role, is because truth is if you don't understand how to measure risk, how to talk in risk, and how to talk in business risk, um, I don't think you're long for this world in a senior cyber leadership role, because you have to be able to communicate it. You have to understand that, and you have to translate it from speeds and feeds to actual business revenue at risk. What are the gaps? What is our actual risk appetite, right? If you're a new security leader going into a company and haven't sat down with the executive leadership and say, what is our risk appetite? What are we willing to accept and what are we not willing to accept? And figuring that out is a big part of our job. And that's ultimately the difference between risk. Risk is what could happen, right? You can bring it down to the the likelihood, the expected, and the loss cost, right? You can get to a formula. There's formulas out there for figuring it out. But ultimately, you've got to be able to take all that information that's coming at you from the technical side of the house and be able to translate that into something that means something to the business, right? And not be, you can plan for the moon crashing into the earth, but what is the realistically, how often is that going to happen, right? So you've got to be able to talk in those terms. And that's what I think the big difference between risk is. If you're managing risk correctly, you're feeding it up the chain correctly, it sells your program. It helps set your budget. It guides the overall framework that you will use. And ultimately, compliance falls out of that. And then you add the governance piece on that. It's just measuring that once you've figured out what your risk is, build a program around it. The governance is making sure that you're measuring it and that people are doing what they're supposed to. And then, like I said, compliance kind of is the component that comes out of you doing all those things.